The air at the billion-dollar Bel Air estate wasn't just thick with the scent of 1,000 white roses, but with secrets. 32-year-old billionaire shipping heir Julian Croft stood beside his pregnant wife Serafina, the picture of perfection. But as she prepared to open a gift, a small blue box from Tiffany's another woman, drenched in rain and fury, stormed through the glass doors. Her name was Isabella, and in her hand she clutched a DNA test. In that single shattering moment, Julian's perfectly curated world didn't just crack. It was about to be obliterated by a truth far more devastating than a simple affair. The sun, a benevolent god in the cerulean California sky, cast a golden sheen over the Croft estate. It wasn't just a house. It was a testament to a dynasty, a sprawling Bel Air palace of glass, white marble, and ambition that clung to the hillside like a conqueror. Fountains, imported from a Florentine villa, sang a gentle soprano over the hum of muted chatter. Today, the estate was a vision in pastel blue and white, a saccharine dreamscape for Serafina Croft's baby shower. Serafina, luminous in a custom-made Dior gown that draped elegantly over her 8-month bump, was the undisputed queen of this kingdom. Her smile, a carefully practiced curve of her lips, never quite reached her sapphire eyes. She moved through the throng of LA's elite tech moguls' wives, aging actresses, and women whose only job was to be beautiful with a grace that was both innate and meticulously constructed. Her life was a masterpiece of acquisitions: the perfect husband, the perfect home, and now the perfect baby on the way. A boy, of course, Julian's heir. Julian Croft, her husband, was the golden scion of Croft Shipping, a global empire built on the salt and sweat of generations. At 32, he possessed a restless energy that his bespoke Tom Ford suit couldn't quite contain. He had his father's sharp, assessing eyes, but his mother's disarming smile, a combination that had served him well in both boardrooms and bedrooms. He played the part of the doting husband-to-be, with practiced ease, his hand a constant proprietary presence on the small of Serafina's back, his laughter echoing just a little too loudly over the string quartet. He watched her now as she accepted a gift from her best friend, a vapid but well-meaning heiress named Chloe. Serafina's delight seemed genuine, but Julian knew the nuances of her expressions. He saw the flicker of something else, something akin to weariness, in the brief moment her smile faltered. Theirs was a marriage of convenience, a strategic merger of two powerful families, the details of which had been hammered out by their fathers over cognac and cigars years before they'd even met. Love was a luxury neither of them had been afforded, but they had a cordial, if sterile, affection for one another. They were partners in the business of being the Crofts. "He's going to have your eyes," darling cooed a woman dripping in Van Cleef & Arpels. Serafina touched her cheek, a gesture of feigned modesty. "Oh, I hope he has Julian's determination. The world is his for the taking after all." Julian joined them, placing a light kiss on his wife's temple. "He'll have the best of both of us." The words were perfect, the delivery flawless. He was an actor in the grand theater of his own life. But even the most accomplished actor has moments when the mask slips. Julian's gaze drifted past the meticulously manicured lawns towards the imposing iron gates that separated their curated world from the chaos of the city below. A ghost of a memory, a scent of rain and cheap perfume, a flash of dark, tangled hair, and a laugh that was anything but muted, flickered at the edge of his consciousness. Isabella. Her name was a discordant note in the perfect symphony of his life. He hadn't seen her in 3 months. He'd ended it cleanly and ruthlessly the day Serafina had announced her pregnancy. It was a business decision, a loose end that needed to be snipped. He'd given her a severance package, as he'd called it, in his own mind a generous sum of money that should have bought her silence and her disappearance. He'd been so sure it had. A server offered him a glass of champagne. He took it, the crystal cool against his suddenly clammy hand. He was being foolish. Isabella was a creature of the city's dark, pulsating heart, a bartender from a world of sticky floors and neon promises. She didn't belong here. She wouldn't dare. Meanwhile, Serafina was being guided to a large, ornate chair, a throne for the mother-to-be at the center of the patio. The mountain of gifts was a monument to excess designer baby clothes, a ridiculously expensive stroller, a sterling silver rattle from Tiffany's. It was all part of the performance. Chloe, acting as the day's master of ceremonies, clapped her hands for attention. Okay, everyone. Time for the main event. Serafina, which one do you want to open first? Serafina's eyes scanned the pile, a polite, detached smile on her face. Her gaze, however, snagged on a small, unassuming box wrapped in simple brown paper tucked away near the bottom. It was starkly out of place amongst the glossy, beribboned packages. There was no card. That one, she said, her voice quiet but firm, pointing with a perfectly manicured finger. Chloe retrieved the box, a look of confusion on her face. Are you sure, darling? It looks… Well, it's not exactly from Chanel. I'm sure, Serafina replied, a strange, unreadable expression in her eyes. Julian felt a prickle of unease. He didn't recognize the wrapping. It wasn't from anyone on their meticulously vetted guest list. A sense of dread, cold and heavy, began to pool in his stomach. He watched as Serafina took the box, her fingers tracing its sharp edges. The string quartet played on a cheerful, oblivious melody that suddenly sounded mocking. The sky, just moments before, so benevolently blue, seemed to darken, as if a storm was gathering just over the hills. And at the gates of the estate, a taxi pulled to a stop. The gates of the Croft estate were designed to be impenetrable, a 10-foot testament to privacy and power. The security guard, a stoic man named Marcus, had a list. If your name wasn't on it, you didn't get in. It was a simple, unbendable rule. So when the taxi deposited a woman who was most definitely not on the list, Marcus stepped out of his guardhouse, his hand resting casually on the butt of his sidearm. She was a stark contrast to the pastel-clad guests he had been waving through all afternoon. She wore a simple, slightly damp black dress, her dark hair plastered to her face by a sudden, unseasonal drizzle that had begun to fall. Her eyes, large and brown and rimmed with fury, were fixed on the house on the hill. "I'm here for the party," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and adrenaline. "Ma'am, there's a private event today. I need to see your name on the list." "It's not on the list," she shot back, her chin jutting out in defiance. "But he's expecting me." He, who Marcus asked, his patience already wearing thin. Julian Croft. The name hung in the air between them. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his posture stiffened. He'd seen women like her before, hopefuls and hangers-on, all trying to get a piece of the Croft fortune. "Mr. Croft is not expecting anyone, ma'am. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice rising. "Not until I've spoken to him. Not until I've given his wife her gift." She held up a manila envelope, now spotted with rain. It was crinkled and worn, as if it had been held in a white-knuckled grip for hours. Back on the patio, Serafina was still holding the small, brown paper-wrapped box. The festive atmosphere had curdled slightly. The guests sensing a shift in the mood, a deviation from the carefully orchestrated script. They watched their smiles, frozen, their eyes hungry for a crack in the perfect facade. "Well, go on, darling," Chloe urged, her voice a little too bright. "Open it." Serafina looked up, her gaze locking with Julian's across the patio. The question in her eyes was sharp and clear. "Do you know anything about this?" He gave a barely perceptible shake of his head, but the lie felt heavy on his tongue. He knew. He didn't know how he knew, but the dread in his gut was now a churning certainty. Slowly, deliberately, Serafina began to unwrap the package. Inside was a simple, unadorned silver locket. It was inexpensive, the kind of thing you might find in a street market, a world away from the designer brands that filled the rest of the gift pile. She opened it. The locket was empty. A collective, confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Chloe let out a nervous laugh. "How quaint. Maybe it's an antique." But Serafina wasn't looking at the locket. She was looking at the small, folded piece of paper that had been tucked inside. Her fingers, steady and sure, unfolded it. She read the few words written on it, her face a mask of serene neutrality. Then she looked up again, her eyes once more finding Julian's. This time, there was no question in them. There was only a cold, hard certainty that mirrored his own. The note said, "Ask him about Isabella, and then ask him about the baby's eyes." At that exact moment, a commotion erupted at the edge of the patio. Shouts, a woman's scream, the crash of a champagne flute. The string quartet faltered, the cheerful melody dying in a discordant squeal of strings. And then she was there. Isabella Ramos, looking like a vengeful spirit, strode through the parted crowd. Her dress was soaked, her mascara was running, but her eyes were twin flames of righteous fury. She had somehow managed to bypass the gate to breach the fortress, and now she stood in the heart of their perfect world, a beautiful, terrible harbinger of its destruction. She ignored the gasps, the whispers, the frantic gestures of the security guards who were now rushing towards her. Her gaze was fixed on one person, and one person only, Julian. "Julian," she said, her voice ringing out across the stunned silence, raw and filled with pain. "You forgot to invite me to your party." Julian froze. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He could feel the eyes of every person on that patio on him, their curiosity turning to ravenous hunger. He saw Serafina still seated on her throne, the note clutched in her hand, her expression unreadable. He saw his mother's face, a mask of horrified disbelief. He saw his entire life, so carefully constructed, so meticulously maintained, beginning to crumble around him. "Isabella," he managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What are you doing here? What am I doing here?" She let out a laugh, a bitter, broken sound. "I'm here to deliver a message for your perfect, pretty wife." She turned her fiery gaze on Serafina. "You might want to see this," she said, holding up the manila envelope. "It's a little gift for the baby." The security guards had reached her now, their hands on her arms, but she didn't struggle. She had done what she came to do. She had lit the match. Now she would stand back and watch it all burn. "Get her out of here," Julian snarled, his voice laced with a panic he could no longer conceal. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. The uninvited guest had crashed the party, and the perfect world of Julian and Serafina Croft was about to come to a spectacular, devastating end. The silence on the patio was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It was broken only by the sound of Isabella's ragged breathing as the guards held her and the distant mournful siren of an approaching police car. Julian, galvanized by a desperate surge of adrenaline, moved to intercept the envelope. "Give that to me." But Isabella was too quick. With a final, defiant cry, she flung the manila envelope through the air. It fluttered a wounded bird before landing with a soft thud right at Serafina's feet. Every eye was now on Serafina. She remained seated, an island of calm in a sea of chaos. She looked from the envelope on the floor to the woman being restrained, and then to her husband, whose carefully constructed composure had shattered into a million pieces. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that was as revealing as any confession. Slowly, with the deliberate grace of a monarch, she bent down and picked up the envelope. Her movements were unhurried, almost languid, as if she were merely an observer to this drama, not its central character. The guests, a captive audience, held their breath. "Serafina, don't," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking. "Whatever she's selling, we're not buying. She's a nobody. She's delusional." "Is she?" Serafina's voice was soft, yet it cut through the tension like a shard of ice. She didn't look at him. Her attention was solely on the object in her hands. She ran a finger over the crinkled paper before unfastening the clasp. Inside was not a single document, but a sheaf of papers. On top was a photograph, a cheap, glossy print of Julian and Isabella, taken in what looked like a cramped, dimly lit apartment. They were laughing, their heads close together, a half-empty bottle of wine on the table between them. Julian's arm was slung possessively around her shoulders. It was a picture of casual, uninhibited intimacy, a stark contrast to the formal, posed photographs that documented his life with Serafina. A collective gasp, like a sudden intake of wind, swept through the crowd. Julian's mother, a formidable woman named Eleanor, took a step forward, her face a thundercloud of fury. "This is outrageous, an absolute disgrace." But Serafina was already looking at the next page, and the next. There were text messages, dozens of them printed out and chronologically ordered. Messages filled with secret codes, clandestine meeting places, and words of affection that were both sickeningly sweet and devastatingly real. "Can't stop thinking about last night. My wife suspects nothing. The yacht Saturday, you're the only real thing in my life, Izzy." Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He had been so arrogant, so sure of his own cleverness, so certain that he had erased all the digital footprints of his betrayal. To see them laid bare like this under the judgmental gaze of his entire social circle was a humiliation beyond measure. But the worst was yet to come. At the very bottom of the pile was the document that had brought Isabella here, the weapon she had deployed with such devastating precision. It was a legally certified DNA analysis report from a reputable lab in downtown LA. Serafina's eyes scanned the technical jargon, the percentages, the genetic markers. Her expression remained unnervingly placid, but a single stray tear escaped and traced a glistening path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "What is that?" Julian demanded, his voice a strangled rasp. "What did she give you?" Serafina finally lifted her gaze from the paper and looked at him. And for the first time that day, he saw past the practiced serenity, past the polished facade, to the raw, wounded woman beneath. Her eyes were not filled with the fiery rage he had expected. They were filled with the profound, bottomless sorrow. "It's a DNA test," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent patio. She held up the paper, her hand trembling ever so slightly. Julian stared at it, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. A DNA test. What did that have to do with anything? And then his eyes fell upon the names listed on the report. Alleged Father Julian Croft. Child unborn male fetus. Sample obtained via non-invasive prenatal paternity test. Mother Isabella Ramos. The world stopped. The air left Julian's lungs. The carefully constructed artifice of his life, the lies he had told himself and everyone around him, came crashing down in a deafening roar of silence. Isabella, watching from the edge of the patio, let out a single triumphant sob. "He's mine." She choked out, her voice thick with a strange mixture of victory and despair. "The baby, his firstborn son, is mine." The revelation hung in the air, a poisonous radioactive cloud. The baby, the heir to the Croft fortune. The child everyone on that patio had been celebrating was not Serafina's. Or rather, there was another one, another heir. Suddenly, Serafina's strange obsession with the brown-wrapped gift, the locket, the cryptic note, all made a horrifying kind of sense. The empty locket wasn't a gift, it was a message. And the note? Ask him about the baby's eyes. It wasn't about her baby, it was about Isabella's. But the final earth-shattering twist was yet to come. As the guests stood frozen in horrified fascination as Julian grappled with the enormity of his exposure, Serafina did something no one expected. She smiled. It was not her usual polite society smile. This was a real smile, a slow spreading curve of her lips that was filled with a chilling, almost predatory satisfaction. It was the smile of a chess master who had just cornered the king. She rose from her throne, the DNA report still in her hand, and addressed the stunned crowd. "Thank you all for coming today. Your generosity has been overwhelming." She paused, letting the irony of her words sink in. "But it seems we have a change of plans." She then turned not to her shattered husband, but to her best friend, Chloe. Her voice was clear, calm, and carried a note of command that no one there had ever heard from her before. "Chloe, darling," she said, her smile widening. "Be a dear and get my other bag, would you? The one from my lawyer's office. I believe it's time for me to open my real gift." The air on the patio, already thick with the fallout of Isabella's bombshell, grew even heavier. Serafina's smile, so out of place in the wreckage of her marriage, was a terrifying spectacle. It held no warmth, only the cold, glittering promise of retribution. Julian, still reeling from the DNA test reveal, could only stare at her, a new kind of dread creeping into his veins. This was not the placid, predictable Serafina he had married. This was a stranger. Chloe, her face a mask of bewildered panic, scurried to obey, fetching a sleek black leather briefcase from the main house. She handed it to Serafina as if it were a venomous snake. Serafina placed the briefcase on the gift-laden table, the sharp click of its latches echoing in the unnatural quiet. She opened it, revealing not a personal item, but a stack of meticulously organized documents, each one tabbed and labeled. This was not the work of a scorned wife. This was the work of a tactician. "Julian," she began, her voice as smooth and cool as the marble beneath her feet. "You seem to be under the impression that our marriage was a merger of equals, that I was merely a decorative childbearing asset to the Croft empire." She picked up the top file. "You were mistaken." She turned to the assembled guests, who were now leaning in their earlier shock, replaced by a ravenous, insatiable curiosity. This was better than any reality show. For the past year, Serafina announced, her voice resonating with newfound power, "while my husband has been occupied." She shot a look of pure contempt at Julian. "I have been busy. You see, when my father agreed to our union, It was not just my hand he offered. It was his company's entire logistics and technology division, the very thing that modernized Croft Shipping and tripled its value in the last 5 years. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Julian's father, a stern, imposing man named Alistair Croft, who had been watching from the sidelines with a face like thunder, took a step forward. "What is the meaning of this, Serafina?" met her father-in-law's gaze without flinching. "The meaning, Alistair, is that the technology my father developed, the patents, the software, they were never fully absorbed into Croft Shipping. They were licensed, and that license," she held up a document, "has an infidelity clause." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was no longer just a domestic drama. This was a corporate execution. Julian's mind raced, trying to find a flaw in her logic, a loophole. "That's impossible. Our lawyers went over everything." "Your lawyers," Serafina corrected him, a hint of pity in her tone. "My lawyers, however, were a bit more thorough. The clause is ironclad. In the event of marital infidelity, proven by irrefutable evidence—" She paused and gestured towards the DNA report still lying on the ground. "Full ownership and all operational control of the logistics and technology division reverts to me. Not to my father. To me." She turned a page in her file. "Which brings me to my next point. Without that division, Croft Shipping's container tracking system goes dark. Its port automation software ceases to function. Its entire global network is for all intents and purposes paralyzed." She looked directly at Alistair. "Your company, the empire your grandfather built, will be a beached whale, and I will hold the key to its survival." The color drained from Alistair Croft's face. He understood. Everyone understood. This wasn't just about revenge. This was a coup. Serafina wasn't finished. She pulled out another document. "And then there's the matter of the prenuptial agreement." She smiled that same chilling, triumphant smile. "You were so certain of your position, Julian, so you were very generous. A beautiful home." She gestured around the magnificent estate, "a generous allowance, a portfolio of stocks. But you see, the prenup also has a clause. It states that in the event of a dissolution of the marriage due to, well, this—" She gestured again at the scene of his humiliation. "The non-offending party is entitled to a settlement. A rather significant one, in fact." She let the document drop onto the table. 50%, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone could hear. 50% of your personal fortune, Julian. Not the family fortune, of course. I'm not that greedy. Just yours. The one you've been so carelessly spending on—" What was her name? Isabella? At the mention of her name, Isabella, who had been watching the proceedings with a mixture of awe and horror, let out a small, broken sound. This was not the outcome she had envisioned. She had come for justice, for recognition for her child. She had not expected to be a pawn in a game so much larger, so much more ruthless than she could have ever imagined. Julian was speechless. He looked from his wife's cold, determined face to his father's apoplectic rage to the greedy, fascinated eyes of his so-called friends. He had been so sure of his power, his invincibility. He had treated Serafina like a beautiful passive object, a part of the scenery of his perfect life. He had never once stopped to consider that beneath the Dior gowns and polite smiles, there was a mind as sharp and as ruthless as his own. He had not just been unfaithful, he had been outplayed. Serafina closed her briefcase with a final definitive snap. "So to summarize," she said, her voice bright and businesslike, "I am leaving you. I am taking control of the most valuable division of your family's company. I am taking this house, and I am taking half of your money." She picked up her purse. "I believe my work here is done. The lawyers will be in touch." She began to walk away, her back straight, her head held high. She moved through the stunned crowd like a queen departing a conquered city. No one dared to speak, to move, to even breathe. But as she reached the edge of the patio, Julian finally found his voice. It was a strangled, desperate cry. "Serafina, the baby, our baby, what about our baby?" Serafina paused, her back still to him. She didn't turn around. Her voice, when she spoke, was laced with an arctic coldness that froze the very air. That she said is the most amusing part of all. She turned then, her face a mask of bitter triumph. "There is no baby, Julian. There never was." She patted her stomach, her perfectly round, 8-month bump. "This," she said, with a hollow laugh, "this is a prosthetic, the best that money can buy." The final revelation, the prosthetic bump, landed not with a bang, but with the hollow, deafening boom of a vacuum. It sucked all the remaining air from the patio. The fake baby, the ultimate deception, was a cruelty so profound it eclipsed everything that had come before. It wasn't just revenge, it was annihilation. For a long moment, after Serafina's triumphant clicking heels faded into the cavernous house, no one moved. They were a tableau of shock, a modern-day Pompeii frozen in the ash of the Croft dynasty's explosion. Then the spell broke. The chaos was not loud, but insidious. It began with the frantic, silent tapping of thumbs on phone screens, the guests transforming from spectators to broadcasters. The world had to know. Whispers erupted sharp and sibilant. "Did you hear? A prosthetic? The infidelity clause? Brilliant. Alistair looks like he's going to have a stroke." The exodus was a stampede in slow motion. Women in pastel dresses and men in expensive linen suits scurried away, avoiding eye contact with the remaining Crofts as if disgrace were a communicable disease. They had come to celebrate an heir, and had instead witnessed an execution. It was the social event of the decade. Julian stood numbly amidst the wilting flowers and deflating balloons, a king in the ruins of his own castle. The world had narrowed to a roaring in his ears. He was only dimly aware of his mother Eleanor, her face a crumbling mask of pride, collapsing into a patio chair, her sobs quiet and mortified. But he was acutely aware of his father, Alistair Croft, a man who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will, advanced on him. His face was a terrifying, mottled purple, his eyes burning with a rage that was ancient and absolute. "You," he spat the word, a projectile. "You did this." "Father, Julian began, but the words died in his throat. "You fool! You arrogant, careless fool!" Alistair's voice was a low growl, more menacing than any shout. "I handed you an empire on a silver platter. I brokered a marriage that secured our future for the next 50 years, and you threw it all away. For what? For some bartender?" He gestured dismissively toward the edge of the patio, where Isabella was now being quietly questioned by uniformed police officers. "It was a mistake," Julian whispered, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. "A mistake?" Alistair laughed, a horrifying, joyless sound. "A mistake is spilling wine on a rug, Julian. This is a catastrophe. She's crippled us. She's taken the brain of our entire operation, the company, our name, everything our family has built for 100 years. You've set it on fire with your pathetic little zipper problem." He grabbed Julian by the lapels of his Tom Ford suit. "You are no longer my son. You are a liability, a disgrace." He shoved him backward, and Julian stumbled, catching himself on the now empty throne where Serafina had presided over his destruction. On the periphery, Isabella watched the family implode, a cold dread seeping into her bones, chilling her far more than the rain-soaked dress. Her victory felt like ashes in her mouth. She had come here seeking justice for her son, to force Julian to acknowledge his responsibility. She had envisioned a confrontation, a confession, perhaps even a grudging acceptance. She had never imagined this. She had been a pawn, a biological weapon, deployed in a war she didn't even know was being fought. Serafina hadn't just known about the affair. She had been waiting for it, counting on it. Isabella's righteous fury now felt naive, her pain a mere tool for a much colder, more calculating rage. As a polite but firm policewoman led her away to give a statement, she locked eyes with Julian one last time. She saw no anger in his gaze, no resentment, only a shared, hollowed-out look of utter devastation. They were two enemies who had just discovered they had been fighting on the same side, and both had lost. The days that followed were a public crucifixion. The story went viral, a perfect storm of wealth, sex, and betrayal. Tabloids ran grainy photos of Isabella under cruel headlines, "The billion-dollar baby mama." Late-night hosts made jokes about the prosthetic bump. Financial news outlets dissected the corporate coup with a mixture of horror and grudging admiration for Serafina's scorched earth tactics. The Croft name became synonymous with scandal. Serafina's legal team moved with the swift, lethal efficiency of a shark strike. The first letter announced the invocation of the infidelity clause. Croft Shipping's stock nosedived. The second was a petition for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The third was a motion to enforce the prenuptial agreement, freezing Julian's personal assets. He watched helpless as his life was dismantled via courier. The Bel Air estate was put on the market. The cars were repossessed. His credit cards were declined. He was forced to move from a palace to a sterile, corporate-leased apartment, the kind he used to keep for trysts. The irony was a constant, bitter companion. He saw Serafina only once more across the vast, polished expanse of a mahogany conference table. She was flanked by a team of lawyers who looked like they dined on broken contracts. She was radiant, dressed in a crimson power suit, a goddess of war. The sorrow he had seen in her eyes on the patio was gone, replaced by a cold, impenetrable resolve. "Serafina, please," he tried the words, feeling clumsy and inadequate. "We can talk about this. There has to be another way." She looked at him, not with hatred, but with a chilling indifference, as if he were a line item she was about to strike from a budget. "We are talking, Julian. This is our conversation. All of this destruction, is it worth it?" he pleaded. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. "You humiliated me," she said, her voice low and steady, but laced with venom. "You stood beside me, your hand on my back, letting me plan a future with a child that was a lie, while you were creating a real one with someone else. You didn't just break our vows, you made a mockery of my life, my hopes. You thought I was a pretty stupid doll you could arrange as you pleased." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "This isn't destruction, Julian. This is a correction, a market adjustment, and you are being corrected." He finally understood. He had not just broken her heart. He had awakened a Leviathan. His family offered no sanctuary. His father refused his calls. His mother, when she did speak to him, did so in clipped, mournful tones, her voice full of shame and disappointment. He was an exile cast out of the kingdom he had been born to rule. Alone, broke and haunted, he finally went, looking for the only other person who understood the full scope of the wreckage. He found Isabella in a cramped, second-floor apartment in the valley, the air thick with the smell of stale cooking and despair. She was paler thinner, her pregnancy now an undeniable swell beneath her worn t-shirt. When she opened the door and saw him, her first instinct was to slam it shut. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of its previous fire. "To talk," he said, his own voice sounding alien to him. He stood in her small living room, a world away from the marble halls he was used to, and he told her everything. The loveless marriage, the corporate contracts, the depth of his own arrogance, and the chilling precision of Serafina's revenge. He didn't ask for pity or forgiveness. He just stated the facts, laying his own stupidity and cruelty bare under the flickering, fluorescent light. She listened, her arms crossed over her belly, her expression shifting from resentment to a weary, grudging comprehension. "She played us," she said quietly, "like puppets." "Yes," Julian admitted the word, a heavy weight. "She did." In the oppressive quiet of that shabby room, surrounded by the ghosts of their affair, a strange, fragile understanding began to dawn. They were not friends. They were not lovers. They were survivors, two deeply flawed people bound together by the innocent, unborn child who was the only legacy of a war they had both spectacularly lost. "What are we going to do?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling, betraying the fear she tried so hard to hide. Julian looked at her, truly. Looked at her for the first time, not as a conquest or a problem, but as the mother of his son. He looked at the gentle curve of her stomach, where the only thing he had left in the world was growing. And in that moment he felt a terrifying, profound, and utterly unfamiliar sense of responsibility. "I don't know," he said, the words heavy with the impossible weight of their new reality. "But whatever it is, we'll do it together." It was not a promise of love or even of happiness. It was a treaty signed in the ruins, a beginning born from a brutal end. 2 years felt like a lifetime. The sensational headlines of the Croft implosion had long since been buried under new scandals, but for the three people at its heart, the fallout was the landscape of their new reality. The world had moved on, but their lives remained irrevocably altered, their orbits forever changed by the gravitational pull of that one cataclysmic day. Serafina Darcy, she had shed the Croft name as if it were a costume from a play that had closed, was not a phoenix rising from the ashes. She was the fire itself. Darcy Innovations became her fortress and her battlefield. She was a terror in the boardroom, her mind a steel trap, her strategies brilliant and merciless. She took the logistics and technology division she had seized and transformed it, pushing into AI-driven predictive shipping and sustainable energy for maritime vessels. Men who had once dismissed her as Julian Croft's pretty wife now trembled when she entered a room. They saw the formidable brain her father had nurtured, now sharpened to a razor's edge by betrayal. Her success was her armor. She lived in a penthouse that was more art gallery than home, a cold, minimalist expanse of white walls, steel, and glass overlooking the glittering sprawl of Los Angeles. Her days were a relentless march of meetings, market analyses, and flights on a private jet to close deals in Singapore or London. She had everything she had fought for: power, respect, financial independence beyond her wildest dreams. but Victory was a cold companion. The silence in her cavernous apartment was absolute, broken only by the hum of the climate control. There were no family photos on the gleaming surfaces, no laughter echoing in the halls. Her life, once a performance for others, was now a performance for herself, a constant, exhausting display of strength. Some nights, the facade would crack. After dismissing her staff, she would pour a glass of expensive scotch, the amber liquid, the only spot of warmth in the stark, monochrome living room, and allow herself to think. She had hired a discreet private investigator, a former Mossad agent, who provided weekly reports. They were delivered in a plain envelope, and they detailed the quiet, unassuming life of her ex-husband and the son he was raising with another woman. She'd study the grainy photos taken from a distance. Julian, his face leaner now, a smudge of grease on his cheek, laughing as he lifted a small boy into the air. Isabella, looking tired but determined, carrying a stack of textbooks. The three of them sharing a pizza on a worn-out sofa in a tiny apartment. Each photo was a fresh torment. She saw in them a life of authentic connection, of shared struggle, and simple joys, the very things she had once craved and had so ruthlessly sacrificed. She had won the war, dismantled an empire, and brought her enemies to their knees. But in doing so, she had built her own gilded cage, and she was its only prisoner. She had chosen power over love, victory over forgiveness, and she was learning day by solitary day the exorbitant price of that choice. Julian's new life was measured in the grime under his fingernails and the honest ache in his muscles at the end of the day. His fall had been brutal and public. Old friends crossed the street to avoid him. Invitations ceased. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that had once been his kingdom. With the last of his unfrozen assets, he bought a failing auto body shop in a forgotten corner of the San Fernando Valley, renaming it Phoenix Motors. The irony was intentional, a private joke for an audience of one. He learned to work with his hands, to feel the satisfying click of a well-tuned engine, the smooth finish of a perfectly applied coat of paint. He found a quiet dignity in the labor, a sense of creation that all his years of leveraging capital and acquiring assets had never provided. He was no longer a scion, he was a mechanic, and he was happier than he had ever been. His relationship with Isabella was a complex tapestry woven from threads of guilt, responsibility, and a strange, unexpected camaraderie. It wasn't love. The scars were too deep for that. But it was a partnership. They argued over bills, over what preschool Mateo should attend, over Julian's tendency to spoil him. But they also learned to lean on each other. When Mateo had a terrifying, febrile seizure in the middle of the night, it was Julian who held Isabella's hand in the stark, fluorescent waiting room of the emergency clinic, their shared fear a bond stronger than any romantic promise. Isabella, for her part, refused to be defined by the scandal. The world had labeled her a homewrecker, a gold digger. She was determined to be more. She enrolled in a paralegal program at a community college, her nights filled with torts and case law after long days of working and parenting. She was fueled by a quiet, ferocious need to build a life for her son that was stable and secure, a life where he would never want for anything, a life she could provide on her own terms. She saw Serafina as a cautionary tale, a woman who had let a man's betrayal turn her into something hard and isolated. Isabella would not make the same mistake. Her revenge would be her success, her happiness. And then there was Mateo. He was the sun, around which their two broken worlds now orbited. He had Julian's piercing blue eyes and Isabella's infectious laugh. He knew nothing of scandals or fortunes lost. He knew only the smell of motor oil on his father's clothes and the soft sound of his mother's voice reading him bedtime stories. He was their shared project, their common ground, their redemption. Julian's first birthday party for his son was a world away from the Bel Air baby shower. It consisted of a homemade cake, a few friends from the garage, and Isabella's family, all crammed into a tiny apartment. It was loud, chaotic, and the most joyful celebration Julian had ever attended. One crisp autumn afternoon, 2 years after the fall, Julian was at a public park with Matteo. He was pushing his son on a swing, the rhythmic creaking, a peaceful metronome to the afternoon. Matteo, now a boisterous toddler, threw his head back and shrieked with laughter, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Julian found himself smiling a real smile that softened the hard lines that had settled around his eyes. He felt a presence beside him and turned. His smile vanished. It was Serafina. She stood there in a tailored wool coat that probably cost more than his entire business. She looked as powerful and immaculate as ever, but up close, he could see the faint, hairline cracks in the porcelain facade. The weariness in her eyes was not just physical, it was soul deep. She had been watching them from her car for 20 minutes, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, before finally summoning the courage to get out. "Hello, Julian," she said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its boardroom authority. He was speechless for a moment, his hand tightening on the swing's chain. Serafina. Her gaze was not on him. It was fixed on Matteo, a look of profound, aching wistfulness on her face. "He's beautiful," she said, the words barely a whisper. "He looks happy. His name is Matteo Julian," replied his voice thick. An abyss of silence opened between them, filled only by the sounds of the park and the ghosts of what they had destroyed. "I was wrong," she said at last, her eyes still on the child. Her confession was so quiet, he almost missed it. "The revenge. The company. I thought it would fix what you broke inside me. The prosthetic, the whole plan. It was born of a pain so deep, I thought it would consume me. I wanted to obliterate you, Julian, to make you feel as small and as helpless as you made me feel." She finally turned to meet his eyes, and he saw a flicker of the woman he had once known before the bitterness had taken root. "And I did. I won. I got everything I thought I wanted. But my life is a ledger sheet, Julian. A series of transactions. I have board members, not friends. I have contracts, not conversations." A small, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "It turns out, you can't build a life out of the rubble of someone else's." Julian looked from her exquisitely tailored loneliness to his son, who was now determinedly trying to climb up the slide, his face a mask of fierce concentration. He saw his past and his present standing side by side. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Serafina said, pulling her coat tighter around her, a futile gesture against a chill that came from within. "There's no absolution for what I did. I just needed you to know that I see it. The cost." She turned to leave, to retreat back to her fortress in the sky. "Serafina." Julian's voice stopped her. She paused, her back to him, a statue of regret. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words were not an excuse, but a confession honed by 2 years of lonely nights and hard-won humility. "For everything. I was a fool, a cruel, arrogant fool. You were my wife, and I treated you like an inconvenience. You deserved a husband. You deserve better than me." She didn't turn around, but he saw her shoulders tremble with a single, silent sob. She lifted a hand to her face, a quick, sharp gesture, before composing herself. Then, without another word, she walked away, her brisk, purposeful stride, carrying her out of the park and out of his life. Julian watched until she was gone, a profound, aching sadness settling over him. There would be no reconciliation, no neat, tidy ending. Their story was a tragedy, a cautionary tale written in the ink of betrayal and revenge. He turned back to his son. Matteo had conquered the slide and was now looking down at him, beaming, his arms outstretched in a wordless demand to be caught. Julian smiled back, his heart swelling with a love that was both fierce and gentle. He had lost an empire. He had lost a fortune. He had lost a wife. But here, in the simple, demanding, and glorious reality of this new life, he had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found himself, and in the eyes of his son, he saw not the end of a dynasty, but the beginning of a new and perhaps better legacy. The drama was over. Life, in all its messy, complicated, and unexpected glory, had begun. And so the empire fell. The queen took her throne, and the fallen king found a new kind of kingdom in the laughter of his son. This wasn't just a story of betrayal. It was a story of transformation, of the brutal, beautiful way that life can be shattered and rebuilt into something entirely new. What do you think? Was Serafina's revenge justified, or did she go too far? Could Julian ever truly redeem himself? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you were captivated by this story of drama, secrets, and lies, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales that prove the truth is always more dramatic than fiction. We have a new story coming next week that you won't want to miss.